So over the last couple of weeks, we've actually showed you what hardware you needed for the Raspberry Pi, and we actually set up the Raspberry Pi software. Tim, what are we going to do this week?
This week we're going to cover a little bit more about the basic settings of the Pi itself, including some settings that we're going to need for future videos.
Awesome, and we'll get to that in just a moment. So we're sitting here back at the computer, and we told you we were going to kind of go over some basic settings that we want to set for the Raspberry Pi. A small disclaimer, we had to go ahead and set up some of these settings beforehand so that we can remote into our Raspberry Pi. So you're going to see some settings already set up, but we're still going to walk you through that process of setting up the Raspberry Pi.
Yeah, and we'll call those out when we hit those so that you understand why it was already set that way.
So, Tim, you want to go ahead and take us through the settings?
Sure. So here we are on the Pi desktop, and to do most of these settings, for some parts of it, we're going to be doing it from a terminal, but to do some of the other settings, they're contained within the System's Preferences applet itself. Pretty much everything you're going to open, if it's not already here as a pre-built shortcut, you're going to open from your Pi menu, which is very similar to the Start button that you have if you're used to Windows.
Yeah, and the first things we're going to go through are actually through the preferences.
Yes. So you go to the Raspberry Pi icon in the top left, Preferences, and Raspberry Pi Configuration.
Yep.
This will bring up a window that'll have several tabs in it that you're going to see. There's going to be a place where you can change your password, which we're going to go ahead and do, I believe, at this point.
Let's go ahead and do that.
So let's go ahead and say change password, and we're going to put in our new password, and so I'm going to type that in. And then you have to confirm it. Like many password dialogues, they want to make sure you don't mistype and then lock yourself out of a system.
Yeah.
The chances are lower if you do it that way. And then it'll let you know if you're successful by saying the password has been changed successfully. You say OK.
Okay.
And then we also have the host name, and we already have the best possible name we could have chosen for a Raspberry Pi host.
Tech Bucket List Pi.
Of course. But if you wish to change it to something else, you'd highlight it and change it appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
And then pretty much all the other options, we don't want to change much of the settings. I'll call a couple things out that you might want to do depending on your setup. Mm-hmm. So for example, you might want to wait for the network to log in. Certain other settings that you type in might need a network before they can take effect. And if you can get in and log in before the network's there, it can have weird consequences. Wi-Fi is an example. It might take you a little bit of time to associate with Wi-Fi or something like that if you have a slow network. But otherwise, we're going to take all those default choices for that tab.
So one quick thing, though.
Sure.
The Raspberry Pi, those of you may not know, the Raspberry Pi comes with a username and password already there. Even though the Pi automatically starts up and comes straight to the desktop,
yep.
There is a username and a password. It's Pi and Raspberry.
Yep.
I believe is the password.
It's default.
So you want that everybody knows that password.
Yep.
You must change it.
Yeah, from a security perspective, it's unacceptable to have a machine sitting on your network that has access to resources that has a password that anybody could randomly use from outside if they manage to get into your network, for example.
Okay, and then the only other thing in here is the resolution. We want to make sure we set the resolution so that you can have it as default, but if it looks like fuzzy on your screen, you want to play with this a little bit. If you got a 1080p screen, you might want to set it to a 1080p resolution just so that it shows up better on your screen and it's not fuzzy and stretched out.
Yeah, and there's different modes depending on what you're connecting. If you're connecting over HDMI, You're going to have some pre-built modes that are clean that you can pick that your monitor should for sure support. It's when you connect to other connectivity methods or using adapter cables or in kind of a more different situation, you might want to be a little conservative about what you pick here. The default, as you notice at the top, is the 720 by 480, and that's considered to be kind of like a very conservative, middle-of-the-road resolution that most devices that they're going to plug in are going to support. And it just depends. So you may have to come in here and see what options you have and try different options to find a good combo that works for you.
Nice.
So for us, we're going to go ahead and stick with the 1920 by 1080, or commonly called 1080p, mainly because we're connected to a monitor that's capable of that display output.
Okay.
And then there's the last thing I was going to say would be that overscan. So if you're connecting to a monitor that's a little older, or a monitor that has maybe, I'm not going to say lower quality, but different preset values for different things, Overscan can help you, because sometimes, like, you can see here everything is on the screen, but what if this button here was off the screen? Overscan can cause that, and the TV can interpret the signal and decide that it needs to show less or more of the screen appropriately. So that can be very annoying. We're like, why is my screen cut off? And that can be a good reason why.
Awesome.
So moving on to our other tabs.
Wait, did it save our settings when we...
Yeah, that's a good point, John. Thank you. So the settings that you apply here take place immediately. There's no apply button or need to say okay or anything like that. All that takes place on the fly. That's the reason why you don't see an apply button or you can say okay, but that takes you out of that dialog instead of actually setting the values. So everything takes place on the fly. So that's why it's very careful. That's why I say to be very careful and use conservative choices when you're making changes, because they take effect pretty much immediately. I think resolution's the only one that doesn't take, like it takes place immediately, but you have a chance to back out if it's not correct. Yeah. So that takes us to our next tab, which is interfaces. And
there's a ton of options on the screen.
Yeah, and we're not going to go into all those right now because this is like a simple introductory to it, but there are a couple places we want to set some values.
Sure. And
that's mainly for future videos, but also it could be common things that you're going to want to have enabled in order to use the Pi to its fullest extent.
And yeah, that's going to be SSH and VNC.
Yep.
SSH is allows us to connect to our Pi through a terminal, and VNC actually allows us to connect to our Pi and actually see the desktop and manipulate things as though we were actually have a monitor connected to the Pi, but it's all remote connectivity. Which
is actually how we're showing you this video today.
Yeah, and we're going to show you how to do that in our next video.
Exactly. So you see how powerful it is already. I'm sure you're going to be looking forward to see how to use it for yourself later.
Okay. Everything else we're going to kind of leave as disabled for the time being.
These are all future videos, though, for sure. We're going to show you how all this works at some point, so just stay tuned. Then that brings us to the Performance tab, and basically the short answer is don't tinker in here.
Yeah, yes, leave it alone.
You'll be unhappy if you do, very likely. And then localization, and this is deceptively important.
Yes, it is. So, so we want to set the locale. Okay. For us, we are in the United States, and so we're going to select U.S. English, and for our country, we're going to select U.S. And then for the character set, we're going to select UTF-8.
Yep, which is our defaults. Time zone, also very deceptively important. If you're not in the right time zone, you can have issues where the system will think it's an hour off when daylight savings time switches back and forth. And it can just be confusing about having a slightly different date and time stamp on things than what is currently being experienced by you in the time zone that you're in. So you'll also notice when you drop down the choice of cities, when you've selected the area, that you're going to see a lot of cities there, but very likely, you're not going to see your city listed there. So, for example, we're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area metroplex, and Dallas is nowhere on here, nor is Fort Worth.
However, Chicago is, because that makes perfect sense to select Chicago for our time zone.
Well, Chicago's a big city at the time, and it lies in the same time zone. So selecting that will give us the right.
So if you take a look at a world map, right, and you can just imagine when we select Chicago, if you think of a vertical line going straight down the world map. There's a slither about this wide, and it goes straight down, and you'll see Chicago, and anything going north and south will be selected in that time zone. If you select a different time zone, that vertical thing shifts to the left or to the right, depending on what time zone you select.
You pick the different time zone, be off plus or minus hours from your current time. So you want to set that, and then for the Wi-Fi country, that's also pretty critical. Initially, you'd think probably it's irrelevant, but it is important because in the case, especially with the Pi that we're talking about and that we're using here that has built-in Wi-Fi, not having the setting correct can cause interference with other devices. It can cause interference with your existing Wi-Fi equipment, cause other devices on your home network to behave oddly, and it can draw a lot more power. So we can all be a little bit of green, and we can also all play along nicely and pick the appropriate scheme for Wi-Fi connectivity so that it uses the correct channels and handovers and all that kind of thing. So we're choosing United States on that as well.
So that's pretty much the basic settings for the Raspberry Pi. Now, we're going to click OK. Now, when you click OK, if you change some settings, there might be some settings that require you to do a reboot. Don't be worried. Just go ahead and say yes and reboot, and your Pi will boot back up into the desktop screen like you see here. So questions for you guys. Have you seen or have you made changes to your Raspberry Pi other than the settings that we made? Are there some very specific settings that you like? Share them in the comments below.
Yeah, we'd like to hear about it. I mean, if there's some settings that you're like, hey, this is critical, I got to have this, why doesn't everybody do it? We'd like to know. There may be something we missed here that's not in the basics that should be.
So another important thing, Tim, is updates, right?
Yes.
So when you get your Raspberry Pi loaded, right, some of the things that you're going to want to do immediately is get the distribution updates and the regular package updates.
Yes.
Okay. And so, Tim, can you walk us through that?
Sure. So this is where we talked about earlier, putting in a command line environment. So this is going to be a little bit different for some of our readers. Again, like I said before, you can either click on the Raspberry Pi and get to Accessories, and from Accessories, choose Terminal, or you can choose the terminal shortcut that they've helpfully placed for you up here on the taskbar, which I'm going to click on. And that'll bring up a terminal, and while technically this is functional, you'll notice the terminal's kind of small.
Yeah, I'm blind because I'm old, and we're not going to discuss how old I am. But I like things bigger. So
easier on the eyes is better. So there's some widgets, and this is a commonality that you're going to see in all Raspberry Pi applications that were built for the Pi. They have some widgets that are built into them, in addition to your file menus that you have here on the left. On the right, you'll have 3 widgets that you are going to use pretty much every time you're using the Pi, which is the dash that looks like a negative sign. You've got a small square, and then you have an X. And the X, you probably have an idea what it does. It closes the window that you have open at the time. But the dash and the box might be different from what you're used to, and what those do is make things bigger or smaller. In our case, we wanted it bigger, so we're going to click on the box, and that gives us a nice full screen view for the terminal.
Much better.
I
can almost see it now.
Yes, excellent. So we're in a command line environment, and Linux, if you ever talk to anybody who knows anything about it, will tell you by default that it is a lot more secure. And a big reason for that is separation of capabilities of users. So for example, you're logged in as Pi, right? Pi doesn't have the ability to do anything privileged, meaning it doesn't have the ability to do anything that would compromise, change, or affect the settings of the system directly. And so you have to elevate or bring that user up to a higher level to be able to make those changes. And that's called the user that can do everything on the system is the root user. And so they'll call that super user. SU. And for us, we want to do something as the super user so that we can do updates. So we do sudo.
Or sudo.
And then we need to do the command. For our purposes, the command we're going to be running is the wonderful apt program, which is a set of wrappers that handles package management. And by package, I mean updates, installation of programs, you name it. Apt can do a lot of things, but for us right now, we're just going to be using it to update. So we're going to do apt, which is apt, and then dash get, because we want to go get updates, from the apt repository. And then we're going to do update. And then it'll think for a bit. And again, if you're used to using Linux, you're going to see maybe a slightly different time frame for doing things, because the Raspberry Pi is, a $35 computer. So you can't expect that to go instantly.
So you'll notice on here that we're already done. So there wasn't a whole lot of updates that came down. And like we said earlier, we had to do some things so that we could actually show this to you on screen a lot easier. So we already got our updates, but the methodology is still the same.
Yes.
apt-get updates.
Now,
to get your updates.
There's a couple of different ways you could do it. You could do it this way like you did it. And then when it asks you, because if you haven't ever updated, if this is the first time you've ever, got yourself on a Pi and used it, and you're going to be updating, you're going to get a lot of updates potentially, right? And including updates that might even require a restart in order for them to take effect.
And they can take a while. They can take up 30 to 40 minutes depending on your internet speed.
Or longer.
Yeah.
So we don't know what your speed is or what your situation is. So just fair warning, don't panic if it seems to take a long time to start getting it. If you see progress and see things proceeding, then you know that you're okay. So don't worry about it. Be patient. Go get yourself a snack. Come back and wait and see where it leads. Now, also, if you get prompted for questions, there are ways to do that update in an automatic way. So, for example, I just typed in -y at the end of my command. And what that means is I'm going to say yes to every question that gets prompted. So if it wants to update this, yes. It wants to update that, yes. It wants to change the setting, yes.
This way you can just literally set it and forget it.
Yeah. Now, this is not always recommended, obviously, for a couple of different reasons. You may not want to take all those updates for whatever reason, but if you don't want to ask any questions and you just want to get to the latest one because you've rebuilt your Pi or something like that, that's always an option. But that covers basically updates. It's pretty much a fire and forget it kind of program.
So Tim, there's a distro update, right? That we would need to get to, right, to update the kernel or whatever.
So we'll do sudo apt get dist update. Or wait, update. And I just screwed that all up.
Okay. So how can we see what the command is, Tim?
Oh yeah, that's right. Update. So with any program, you can do --help, and also they have manuals. So you can do man at get. And the manual is truly a manual. It's interactive.
There it is right there. Dist upgrade.
Yeah, that's where I went. That's where I made my mistake. So let's get out of that. And let's do sudo apt get dist upgrade.
That looks better, huh?
Yeah. And then it's asking you for yes, no to do that update. And you say yes.
And so Linux is very difficult, right? Because there's very different flavors of Linux. So we may use apt-get here. In other distros, there's other ways of getting the software. So it's not like Windows where there's only one way to do everything. Yes. Every flavor of Linux has its own twist on how to do things. So while Linux is very powerful, there's also a learning curve for every specific distribution out there.
Yes, so. and that lack of monoculture is a strength and a weakness. So you definitely have to just keep track of that and learn your specific environment. Stay in one environment if that helps a little bit until you really feel comfortable and familiar with it, and then you can branch out and try other environments afterward.
Awesome. So that's how we set up the basic Pi, the basic configuration for the Pi. That's how we get the updates. Join us next week when we go and talk about remoting. We're going to show you how to remote using SSH and VNC, those two settings that we set during the configurations. And don't forget to subscribe.
Hit that bell.
Hit the bell.
Please.
Leave comments below, and we will see you next Tuesday.
Thanks for taking the time to be with us.